Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Little Rock, where love is our teaching and service is our prayer. If you're a newcomer, we're glad you've chosen to join us for worship today. While you're here, please stop by our guest table to fill out a guest card and pick up some information about our church. And especially remember to mark your calendar for UUCLR's annual Lessons and Carols service, which will happen on 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve. We hope you and any of your visiting loved ones will join us for that special evening service. I now invite Janice Peters, there she is, to come forward to light the chalice and lead us in our affirmation of covenant, which is printed in your order of service.
I light this chalice with these words: open our eyes to see what is beautiful, open our minds to learn what is true, open our hearts to love one another. Please join me in the affirmation of covenant, which you will find printed in your order of service, saying, love is the doctrine of this church, the quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge and freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant with each other.
I grew up with Advent calendars and an Advent wreath on the kitchen or dining room table with its 4 candles, one for each Sunday in Advent. And some years we would even light the candles at home and hear a meditative reading before our Sunday dinner. While I no longer continue those rituals, I always notice the beginning of Advent and feel, as the commercial frenzy heats up, that I should make sure to slow down and take time to contemplate hope, peace, joy, and love, the themes those 4 candles represent. This year, with the war continuing in Gaza under the fiction of a ceasefire, my Advent reflections are drawn to the thought of a child born in Palestine. Last week, for the first time in 2 years, a Christmas tree was lit in Bethlehem, a Palestinian city in the middle of the occupied West Bank. It is an event of secular importance because it draws tourists during the Advent season and no doubt boosts local incomes. But those tourists are not the only Christians in Israel and Palestine. It is not the case that all Israelis are Jews and all Palestinians are Muslims. Tarek Bakoni, the author of today's reading, was born into a family of generations of Palestinian Christians. For centuries, the entire region of the Levant, encompassing not only Palestine and Israel, but also Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria, has been home to a religiously diverse population. And for centuries, those who live there have, in various ways, met the challenge of peace. That today's war in Gaza continues is no surprise. The pattern now is always the same. From the sea of hostility and violence that is the status quo in Israel and occupied Palestine, violence breaks out. The Israeli Defense Force retaliates. International pressure brings about a 3-stage peace process: ceasefire, reconstruction, and then, it is hoped, peace. The process always stalls in the first stage because violence continues despite the declared ceasefire. This pattern always puts the United States in a position of guarantor of Israel's good faith, and so we should never be surprised when we are blamed when the process collapses. The last U.S. president to succeed in making a lasting peace between Israel and one of its neighbors was Jimmy Carter. Peace on earth and goodwill toward neighbors seem the furthest things from life in the Holy Land. In his memoir, Fire in Every Direction, Tariq Bakoni recalls his childhood in Jordan. We lived in a stone house in Al Abdali on the seam between East and West Amman, where my parents landed after fleeing the civil war in Lebanon, privileged enough to bypass the East's refugee camps, but not yet sufficiently affluent to settle in the West. I spent my first decade in that stone house. Memories crowd my mind when I conjure that world. The bloody knee I got running around our garden, breaking my front teeth as my brother Laith chased me, pretending to be a vampire, while Mama mopped the balcony. Our conservative neighbor calling Mama to complain that Laith was playing basketball topless in the street in 85-degree weather. "He's making my daughter think impure thoughts," the neighbor had complained. "Good for her," answered Mama, and hanging up. Other memories, inherited, excavated, also rush in. Memories that frighten me with their malleability, their unreliability, their provenance. Most of what surfaces I brush aside, one after the other, until I'm left with a few strands. These I order, curate to form a coherent whole, a singular narrative, one that might hold a spirit of resemblance to the truth. When Israel was founded in 1948 in what Zionists call the War of Independence and Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe, Bakoni's grandparents were all living in Haifa. His mother's parents had moved from Jerusalem to Haifa 2 years before. His grandfather, a Christian minister, had accepted a call to serve a church there. Bakoni's grandmother told him that she had just begun to feel at home in Haifa when Zionists began to occupy the city, barricading the city center from the suburbs, forcing their flight overland to Beirut. His father's parents were longtime residents of Haifa. They escaped by sea from Haifa's port to Beirut's. His parents met as students at the American University in Beirut. When they fled Beirut during Lebanon's civil war, right-wing Christian phalangists controlled the city, occupied the university campus, and had begun arresting Palestinians. His mother's uncle had fled to Amman in 1948, and so they found refuge there. To avoid trouble in that socially conservative town, the uncle pressured them to hurry up and get married already. It's bad enough being a Palestinian refugee here without living in sin. And so they did. Bakoni wrote a little of what he knows about his mother's childhood. The house where Mama was born and raised sat on an incline facing Tal al-Zatar, a large camp whose refugees were among the first Nakba survivors to arrive in Lebanon. For my grandmother, they had been spared the camps because they believed in Jesus Christ. No matter that there would eventually be other Christians who were unable to get the same privileges, as the government soon limited its intake even of Christian refugees. God works in mysterious ways, my grandfather had used to say in Haifa, and what was more proof of that than her family's fortune after their immense misfortune? For Mama, the existence of Tal al-Zatar was a scab that had to be picked over and over again. Those were the camps they would have ended up in, should have ended up in. A fascist policy was the only reason her life unfolded in the small flat down the road instead of in Tal al-Zatar's ramshackle tin-roofed structures. When Mama was at the all-girls evangelical school before she was old enough to grapple with the enormity of her history, she would often take a detour into Tal al-Zatar on her way back home. She ran around its alleys playing soccer or skipping rope. Although an outsider to the camp, she quickly became a part of its world, making friends with 2 girls and a boy, Mona, Lubna, and Abdullah. All 3 went to UN schools administering to the needs of Palestinian refugees. Theirs were 2 divergent worlds, a fact the kids only took notice of when mocking Mama's school uniform, not because hers was different, but because it was, without fail, rumpled and smudged. When she graduated from secondary school at the top of her class, there were no high schools for girls in the area. There was only the all-boys evangelical school. That year, the school made an exception for 3 talented girls to join their cohort. Mama got the first spot, Mona the second. She drifted from Lubna and Abdullah after starting at university, even as she and Mona stayed close, partying, flirting with boys, riding on the backs of mopeds around the city, down to the beach or up to the mountains for lunches that turned into dinners. A hedonistic bliss that, for a while at least, kept at bay the signs in the city around them, the whispers that proliferated with every encounter, the percolating awareness that Beirut was veering toward the abyss. Until one morning in the summer of 1976, when the Phalangist militiamen dressed in brown, orange-timmed army fatigues and light brown T-shirts, rifles slung over their shoulders, put Tal al-Zatar under siege. They had done this before, surrounded the camp, intimidated it, blocked off supplies to it. But this was different. All along the camp's entrances, metal barriers were erected, a border where none had existed before. Flimsy structures that could have easily been swept aside if it weren't for the soldiers standing behind them, their idle but confident postures, confirmation of what everyone knew. The country was in a civil war, and the Palestinian refugees were in the middle of it. Recalling again his own childhood, Bakani tells of how when his father's export business became profitable, the family was able to move into West Amman with its imposing houses and well-maintained facades, which looked nothing like al-Abdali's gritty and overcrowded streets. Although a 20-minute drive away, it was like relocating to another city. From our new neighborhood, Amman seemed vast, rich, with expansive streets, manicured front gardens, and endless backyards. The chaos of the east receded, its yellowed and stained limestone giving way to polished white exteriors. Before our eyes, Amman morphed into a grand city, nestled in its 7 hills, imposing, unfazed. One afternoon, his mother took him and his brother Laith on a spontaneous excursion. Laith had been begging for weeks to visit the film set where part of Indiana Jones was being shot. We drove for almost an hour north out of the city through the hills surrounding Amman, down to Jerash, a town nestled between the ruins of a long-lost Roman world and the ruins of ours, in the form of the largest Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan, which had sprouted right next to it. We were driving on the overpass built above the entrance to the camp when Mama said, "Look how they leave them to rot in this place." Laith scooted over to my side as we both stared out the window. The buildings were haggard, brown, and stained, unlike Amman's polished limestone, and the streets denser and more cramped than other parts of the city. But I was not sure why Mama appeared so aggrieved. The scene did not look much different from Al Abdali or Amman's downtown, generally chaotic and overcrowded. Laith must have thought the same. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "And who's they?" I added. Mama glanced back at us in the rearview mirror and said nothing for a few minutes. "The big shits," she said. "Men who think they know what they're doing." I giggled as Laith, 5 years older than me and thinking himself an adult, leaned over to the front seat and tapped Mama on the shoulder. "Mama," he whispered, "you can't say shit in front of Tarek." They arrived at the Roman ruins and walked through the place where the movie set was, through the ruins to that place, and he and his mother found a place to sit while Laith got lost in the crowd exploring the set. He writes, "The sun was low by the time they returned to the ruins, a space that had morphed from an imposing, majestic Roman arena into a bustling market. The smell of chestnuts and roasted peanuts wafted through the air and mingled with the steam from tubs of boiling water cooking sweet corn. Lemons, grapes, oranges, grapefruits, merchants were shouting, riffing off one another and adding to the din of the gathering crowds. Stalls piled high with fresh fruit and vegetables from the surrounding valleys had been set up next to others with stacks of socks and underwear or spices and kitchenware. Shoppers had begun congregating in the market, haggling as they walked through. The space had a carnival-like atmosphere, and I knew before she said anything that Mama would be itching to leave within seconds. "We should head back," she said on cue. My eyes scanned the stalls. It was the sparkle that caught my attention. I pulled Mama aside and into an alley tucked between rows of merchandise. Dolls had been hung from the iron metal bars holding up one shop front. They were much larger than normal, more figurines than dolls, almost half my size and dressed in the most grotesque outfits. Mounds and mounds of chiffon and sponge-like material had been stitched around their waist to create bell-curved gowns that fell as almost perfect circles around their legs. The dolls had round, painted faces, and their eyes were large and maniacal. Glittering beads had been sewn into the gowns, and the dolls had tiaras attached, glue visible to their heads. The fabrics were washed-out pastel colors, light green, pink, and blue. I latched on to an orange-brown one, transfixed, barely registering Mama's half-hearted attempts to nudge me to move on. Her efforts were futile. Within seconds, the doll and I were inseparable, destined to be together. Mama shook her head and turned to the vendor, an elderly man who offered an amused smile and a shrug of his shoulders. Defeated, she made the payment and walked away from the stall with me and Laith in tow. Before walking to our car, we sat for a brief rest. I made sure my doll had a comfortable position on the hard stone next to me and glanced up with satisfaction. The look Mama and Laith gave me was one I would become intimately familiar with. It was a look not unsettling enough to upset me, yet not so innocuous as to be forgotten either. In the most abject of spaces, in the queerest of selves, beauty abounds. There was another layer in Tarek Bakoni's childhood experience that he slowly became aware of and struggled to make sense of. In this ancient and war-torn land, in these conservative cultures, he was growing up gay. He describes it by talking about darting shadows in his childhood environment, looks like those his mother and brother gave him in response to his delight over that doll. and other subtle, unspoken judgments. Sights unseen, words unspoken, realities despised, our most essential truths, our most precious meaning. But I wonder, was there another layer to his mother's expression as he played with a doll dressed in the colors of the fascist Christian phalangists? My Advent reflections have included other children of Palestine. Dr. Ahmed Yusuf last month at St. Mark's Episcopal Church spoke about his experiences the last 2 summers on medical missions to Gaza, of the impossible conditions created by the destruction and restrictions imposed by the Israeli Defense Forces, and of all the children he and his colleagues could not save. Miko Peled, son of an Israeli general and grandson of a signer of Israel's founding documents, spoke in October at New Millennium Church about growing up in a prominent, privileged Zionist family, segregated from his Palestinian neighbors, and taught Zionist misrepresentations of why the world around him was the way it was. When his niece was killed in a suicide bombing, he began a quest to try to understand both the Palestinian people and the Zionist milieu of his boyhood. He is now the founder and president of the Palestinian House of Freedom in Washington, D.C. He mentioned meeting members of a Hasidic community in Jerusalem who were committed to practicing Judaism there, but who believe in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious Israel and are religiously exempt from military service in the Israeli Defense Forces. Rabbi Abby Stein, a trans woman who was raised in Brooklyn's Hasidic community and now serves an Orthodox Jewish congregation there, and currently is serving on Mayor-elect Mamdani's transition team, traces her ancestry to many generations who lived in Jerusalem before Zionism took hold there. A child of Palestine at a remove, we might say. She speaks of that ideology's impact here in the United States as an erasure of Judaism. She says, Zionism boils down Judaism to this militaristic, violent society born out of violence and what they would call a necessary expulsion of hundreds of thousands of people. She says, my own grandmother, who was born and raised and got married and had her family in Jerusalem, would say, Zionism destroyed my city or my country, depending on the context. The modern ideas of Zionism, both political and religious, are considered contradictory to traditional Jewish belief in almost all Hasidic communities. It's complicated. It's complicated. There are layers and layers. And it's not only affecting the children of Palestine, if that weren't enough. Perhaps the most compelling reason to pray for peace and a peaceful path to it is the displaced, disorienting, and damaging childhoods these adults tell about in order to make sense of them to us and to themselves. How much of their precious vitality and creativity has been burned up trying to make sense of turmoil and abuse and lies in childhood and for the rest of their life, because the pain and puzzles of childhood stay with us. And no child should have to suffer those things. How much of it, how much of their precious life, energy, and creativity has been diverted from hope, joy, and love. If we are to pray for anything, I think we ought to pray that one day soon, every child in Palestine and everywhere else can indeed sleep in heavenly peace. So may it be. Amen.
Please join me in saying the words written in your bulletin as we extinguish the chalice. I don't have the words here.
Go out into the world in peace, have courage, hold on to what is good, return to no person evil for evil, strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, help the suffering, honor all beings. And may you pass on the light of hope, peace, joy, and love.